Her first day as commander was supposed to begin inside the precinct walls. Instead, it began with a trial by fire in the parking lot. Before she could even cross the threshold, she was ambushed by 3 of her own officers, blind to the rank she was about to hold. They profiled her, insulted her, and threatened her with the very laws she was now sworn to uphold. With a silence more powerful than any shout, she absorbed their contempt, walked straight through their wall of intimidation, and stepped into the office that made her their superior. But petty revenge was a game for lesser players. She had a war to win, a plan not just to discipline 3 men, but to expose the rot festering just beneath the surface of the entire department in a system built to protect its own. Can one woman's quiet dignity be enough to shatter the blue wall of silence? We all see the headlines, but these moments often happen on quiet streets, away from the cameras. Think about your own town, your own city. What does accountability truly look like where you live? Let us know in the comments. If this story already has you holding your breath, show your support by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribing for more powerful stories that dare to ask the hard questions. It was just before 7 when the quiet click of a car door echoed in the otherwise still air of the south parking lot. Charlotte Reed didn't slam things. She didn't rush. Even now, even here, reporting to a new precinct on her first day, she moved with a practiced economy of motion, a calmness that seemed to emanate from her very core. The early sun was still low, casting long, distorted shadows from the chain-link fence that bordered the lot, its light glinting off the windows of the imposing brick and concrete building that was the station. The air smelled of cool asphalt and the faint, ever-present scent of exhaust fumes that clung to the city's bones. She stood for a moment, a solitary figure in tailored gray slacks and a simple, unadorned blouse, holding a sealed manila envelope under one arm. The choice of attire was intentional. No uniform today. Not yet. She wanted to watch the station wake up before she walked through its front doors, to feel its rhythm from the outside before she stepped inside to change it. Her contact from records was supposed to meet her here with a set of last-minute files. A simple handoff. 5 minutes. Maybe less. She checked the time on her phone, her expression unreadable, her posture a study in placid stillness. A burst of static sliced through the quiet. From the corner of the building, a figure had emerged, broad and uniformed. Charlotte didn't turn, didn't even lift her head, but her focus sharpened. The sound was distinct, the squelch and release of a shoulder radio's transmit button. The voice that followed was a low baritone, deliberately pitched to carry in the morning air. Dispatch. Be advised. Got an unauthorized civilian loitering by the south lot entrance. Keeping an eye on it. A click, and then silence. Charlotte's jaw remained relaxed, but a familiar, weary tightness settled deep in her gut. The message wasn't for dispatch. It was a dog whistle, a territorial marking meant only for her. She had hoped, for a fleeting moment, that this place might be different. The static hiss was the answer to that unspoken hope. The heavy tread of regulation boots on pavement grew louder, a deliberate, rhythmic crunch that announced the officer's approach long before he spoke. She turned slowly, her movements measured, to face him. He was square-jawed and thick in the neck, a man who looked like he'd been poured into his uniform and left to harden. His hand hovered near the butt of his holstered sidearm, not as a direct threat, but as a constant, implicit reminder of the power he held. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, raked over her, from her professional but simple hairstyle down to her sensible flats, and his expression was carved from pure, unadulterated suspicion. "This is a restricted area," Officer Marcus Dalton said. His voice was flat, devoid of any pretense of courtesy. It was the voice of a man who had already seen enough and made up his mind. "We've had issues with break-ins around this side of the lot. I'm going to need you to state your business. Right now." Charlotte held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated by the hostility radiating from him. Her own voice, when she spoke, was a stark contrast to his. calm, even, and professional. "I'm waiting on a file transfer," she said. "Official business? It shouldn't take long," Marcus grunted, a dismissive sound deep in his chest. He looked her up and down a second time, more slowly now, as if searching for the flaw that would confirm his initial assessment. His eyes paused on her shoes, and a flicker of something, disdain, perhaps, crossed his face. They told him everything he thought he needed to know. "Uh-huh," he muttered. She watched him, her patience a silent, invisible shield. He saw a woman who didn't belong, dressed in clothes that didn't scream authority, standing in a place he considered his own. He saw a problem to be managed, a disruption to the natural order of his world. "This entrance is for staff." "Ma'am," Marcus said, his voice laced with condescension. "We have protocols. They're what separate us from them." The words hung in the air, a clear line drawn in the concrete between them. Charlotte's expression didn't change, but her focus became razor sharp. She met his gaze directly, her voice quiet but unwavering. "And who is them?" "Officer." The direct question seemed to momentarily surprise him. He had expected deflection, or perhaps nervous compliance. He recovered quickly, a slight, cold smirk touching the corner of his mouth. It was a smirk of absolute certainty, of power held and wielded without question. "People who don't have a reason to be here," he replied. He took a deliberate step forward, subtly closing the distance between them, a classic tactic of spatial intimidation. His voice dropped, losing its official, clipped tone and taking on something lower, more personal, and infinitely more threatening. "Look," he said, leaving her title unspoken, a deliberate stripping away of formality. "This ain't your neighborhood, and that ain't your entrance. Unless you work here, you're going to have to take a walk before this becomes a problem." Before Charlotte could formulate a response to the thinly veiled threat, the squeak of another pair of regulation boots on the pavement announced a new player had entered the arena. Officer Sophia Marks moved with a wiry, restless energy that was a sharp counterpoint to Marcus's brutish stillness. She was younger, with a blonde ponytail pulled so tight it seemed to stretch the skin at her temples, and her eyes had a hard, cynical glint. She came to a stop beside Marcus, not even bothering to glance at Charlotte at first, instead directing her attention to her senior partner, as if they were the only two people present. As she approached, she gave her duty belt a slight, performative hitch, a gesture of settling in for a confrontation she clearly intended to enjoy. "Some people just don't hear the first time, do they, Marcus?" she said, her voice dry and laced with a theatrical weariness. "You gotta spell it out for them." Only then did she turn her gaze on Charlotte, her eyes sweeping over the plain gray blouse and slacks with an expression of profound boredom. The two officers now stood together, a united front of blue and brass, their posture radiating a shared, unassailable authority. In response to this escalation, Charlotte's movements remained fluid and deliberate. She slowly reached into the inner pocket of her jacket, her actions telegraphing no threat, no sudden moves. She produced a small, laminated card and held it out, not shoving it in their faces, but presenting it in the space between them. "Here is my identification," she said, her tone unwavering. Sophia leaned in, squinting dramatically as if the card were written in a foreign language. She didn't touch it. A short, sharp chuckle escaped her lips. "That's a laminated card, sweetheart. Please." She rolled her eyes at Marcus. Dalton didn't even bother to look at the ID. His focus was entirely on Charlotte's face, his own expression hardening as his patience wore thin. "You have 10 seconds to step off this lot," he growled. "You can wait wherever civilians wait, or I can take you in for trespassing while we sort this out. Your call?" It was at that moment a third officer appeared, emerging from the staff entrance with a styrofoam coffee cup in his hand. He was the youngest of the three, with a scattering of freckles across his nose that seemed at odds with the severe uniform. Officer Ethan Mason had clearly just been stepping out for a breath of air, but he froze, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the scene. He saw two senior officers cornering a civilian woman, their stances aggressive, their voices sharp. His gaze flicked from Marcus's clenched jaw to Sophia's mocking smirk, and finally to the ID still held in Charlotte's steady hand. A flicker of doubt, of profound unease, and crossed his face. As Marcus issued his threat of arrest, Ethan subtly shifted his weight, his right hand moving instinctively toward the small notepad on his belt. A gesture born from academy training: document, de-escalate, gather facts. Marcus, attuned to the slightest break in his dominance, caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. Without turning his head, he took a short, deliberate half-step back into the side, a subtle repositioning that physically blocked Ethan's line of sight to Charlotte. It was a masterful, non-verbal assertion of control. The message was unmistakable. "This is not your play. Stand down." He then shot a quick, venomous glance at the younger officer, a look so cold and sharp it froze the words in Ethan's throat. Ethan's hand dropped from his notepad. His shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. He had been silenced. Charlotte saw it all, the flicker of conscience in the young officer and its swift, brutal suppression. She didn't sigh. She didn't show frustration. She simply absorbed the information. Her tone, when she finally spoke again, was so calm it was almost unnerving. "Are you sure you want to do that?" she asked Dalton. She then tucked the ID back into her pocket and, in a stunning act of defiance, turned her back on them and began walking with unhurried steps toward the staff entrance. She moved past them as if they were statues, irrelevant obstacles in her path. The sheer audacity of the act left them speechless for a second. Then, rage flooded Marcus's face. "Don't you walk away from me," he barked, his voice cracking with fury. It was a lawful order, sharp and indisputable. "You are still on restricted ground, and I have not cleared you." Sophia, recovering quickly, folded her arms, the cold little smirk returning to her lips. "Sounds like someone's trying to talk her way out of a situation she created," she said, loud enough for her voice to carry. "And failing." Charlotte stopped mid-step. She turned her head slightly, just enough to look at them over her shoulder, a gesture that was neither fully compliant nor wholly dismissive. It was controlled, it was powerful, and then she delivered the blow. "Do you treat all women like this?" she asked, her voice still quiet, yet every word cutting through the tense air. She paused for a beat, letting the question hang, before adding with surgical precision, "Or just the black ones?" The question landed with the force of a physical slap. For the first time, a crack appeared in their armor of smug certainty. A stunned silence descended, thick and charged. Sophia was the first to recover, letting out a short, scoffing laugh that didn't quite cover her shock. "Only the ones who act guilty," she shot back, the comeback sounding rehearsed and weak. Marcus, however, took the accusation as a personal challenge. He visibly bristled, his neck flushing a dull red. He stepped forward again, his voice rising in volume to reclaim his dominance. "You know what I think? I think you're stalling. I think you're hiding something. And if we find out you've lied about being on official business, that's obstruction." He pointed a thick finger at her. "That's jail time." Across the lot, a man walking a small terrier paused by the fence. He observed the scene, two armed officers berating a lone, calm woman. The dynamic was unmistakable. He discreetly pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb swiping across the screen. Angling the lens through the gaps in the gate, he pressed record. The officers, lost in their escalating confrontation, didn't notice the small, silent electronic eye that was now bearing witness. Without another word, Charlotte turned from their sputtering accusations, her back straight, and continued her unhurried walk toward the heavy glass door of the staff entrance, leaving them standing in a cloud of their own impotent fury. She didn't look back. The satisfyingly solid thud of the door closing behind her was a punctuation mark, a definitive end to the confrontation. It sealed off the acrid air of the parking lot in the heat of their anger, replacing it with the cool, recycled air of the precinct. The sounds shifted instantly, from their frustrated shouts to the low, anonymous hum of fluorescent lights, the distant ringing of a phone, and the smell of industrial-strength coffee mingling with disinfectant. No one looked up as she passed through the corridor. Here, she was just another woman in professional attire, invisible in the mundane morning shuffle of a building slowly coming to life. She moved through it all with the same unreadable placidity, her expression betraying nothing of the venom she had just faced. 20 minutes later, the main conference room buzzed with the low murmur of conversations. Officers milled about, filling their cups at a coffee machine in the corner, swapping stories from the night shift, the air thick with casual camaraderie and cynicism. By the coffee pot, two veteran officers, their faces etched with the familiar weariness of 2 decades on the force, spoke in low tones as younger patrol officers filed past them to find seats. "You hear about the new commander?" the first one asked, stirring a plastic stick in his cup. "Straight from the downtown political shuffle, never walked a beat a day in her life." "I bet," the second officer grunted, leaning against the counter. "That's how it is now. It's not about what you've done, it's about what you look like. Just keep your head down. This, too, shall pass." They shared a look of grim, knowing resignation, a silent agreement that this new leadership was just another administrative hurdle to be tolerated, not respected. At precisely 8:30 a.m., the main conference room doors swung open. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. A wave of silence rippled through the space, conversations clipping off mid-sentence, the rustle of notepads and uniform fabric giving way to a sudden, expectant stillness. 25 officers turned their heads as one. Commander Charlotte Reed stepped inside. She was no longer the unassuming woman in the gray blouse. Now she was in her full dress uniform, the dark fabric impeccably tailored, the creases sharp as a razor's edge. The polished brass on her collar, the eagles of a commander, gleamed beneath the recessed ceiling lights, catching the eye and holding it. She held no files, no memos, only a small remote in one hand. Her expression was the same as it had been in the parking lot, calm, composed, unreadable. But in this context, her stillness was no longer passive. It was a projection of pure, undiluted authority. The room stiffened almost involuntarily. Toward the center, Marcus Dalton sat with his arms crossed, his jaw so tight a muscle pulsed near his ear. His face was a thunderous mask of disbelief and dawning rage. To his left, Sophia Marx's face had gone pale, the smug smirk completely gone, replaced by wide-eyed, frozen shock. In the back corner, Ethan Mason, who had been trying to make himself as small as possible, sat bolt upright, his spine rigid, his hands locked together under the table. He looked as though he'd just witnessed a ghost walk through the wall. Charlotte moved to the front of the room. She didn't ask for quiet. She didn't have to. She let the silence settle, let their eyes take in the uniform, the rank, the impossible truth. Then she spoke, her voice calm but firm, carrying to every corner of the now silent room. "Let's begin," she said. "I'm Commander Reed. As of this morning, I've assumed leadership over this precinct." The silence in the room was a living thing, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the low hum of the projector fan she had just activated with a click of the remote in her hand. Charlotte surveyed the faces looking back at her, letting the weight of the moment sink in, allowing the shock to curdle into uncomfortable reality. Her gaze swept past the stunned expressions of Marcus, Sophia, and Ethan, lingering for a moment on the other officers, the curious, the resentful, the cautiously hopeful. "You've all seen changes in command before," she began, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the tension. "So let me be explicit. This one won't be about adjusting office furniture or rearranging patrol routes." She took a step forward, her eyes connecting with individuals in the crowd. "This is about culture. It's about conduct. And more than anything else, it's about accountability." She clicked the remote once. The screen behind her, previously a blank white, was now filled with a grainy, black and white photograph. It showed a young black man in a crisp patrol uniform, standing beside a squad car. He was smiling, but it was a quiet, confident smile, and his eyes were steady, unwavering, looking directly at the camera with a sense of profound purpose. The badge on his chest was polished to a mirror shine. "This is my brother," Charlotte said, her voice softening just a fraction, a hint of warmth touching the cool steel of her tone. "Officer Daniel Reed." A few officers leaned forward slightly. Marcus Dalton didn't move a muscle, but his hand, resting on the table, curled slowly into fists. "He served in a precinct a lot like this one for nearly a decade," Charlotte continued, her eyes fixed on the image behind her. "Never missed a day, never drew his weapon unnecessarily, never failed a call. He believed in the uniform. He believed that the badge meant something." She paused. "And then one afternoon, he made what this department considers a mistake. He defended a female rookie who was being harassed by her own partner. He filed a report. He told the truth." As she spoke of her brother, the emotional landscape of the room began to shift. The narrative wasn't just a story, it was a mirror, and each officer saw a different reflection. A few of the younger patrol officers, men and women who still carried the unblemished ideals of the academy, stared down at their notepads, their jaws tight with a familiar, second-hand shame. They knew stories like this. They prayed they would never become one. In the center of the room, a handful of older, hardened officers, men who had come up with Marcus, who saw the world through the same cynical lens, subtly crossed their arms in unison. Their expressions hardened into a stony mask of defiance, a silent declaration of solidarity against what they perceived as an attack on their way of life. Near the side wall, Officer Isabella Lopez, a veteran with kind eyes and a reputation for quiet competence, simply closed her eyes for a long moment. Her face was a mask of placid sorrow, as if she were replaying a memory she couldn't erase, a story she knew all too well. Charlotte's voice drew every eye back to the front. Another click of the remote. The photo of her brother vanished, replaced by large, stark white letters against a black background. "Character is who you are when there's no one recording." The words seemed to hum with accusation in the quiet room. She turned from the screen to face them fully, her gaze sweeping across the crowd before landing, just for a second, on Marcus and Sophia. "Some of you like to think your job starts with your badge," she said, her voice dropping lower, slower, drawing them in. "It doesn't. It starts when you decide who you are without it." After letting the quote hang in the air, a silent indictment, she lowered the remote to her side. "My brother made a choice. The officers he reported made choices. Every day, on every shift. You make 100 small choices when no one is watching. Who were you yesterday, after you clocked out? When you were just a person in a grocery store, in traffic, in your own home? Who will you be tomorrow, when you're faced with a choice between what is easy and what is right?" She let the question settle, the silence stretching until it was almost unbearable. One or two throats tightened audibly. A chair creaked. "Because someone was watching this morning," she said, her voice now barely above a whisper, yet it carried the force of a thunderclap. A visible ripple of shock went through the room. Marcus's face, already a mask of fury, seemed to drain of color. Sophia's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine fear finally breaking through her shock. "I'm not here to humiliate anyone," Charlotte continued, her tone even. "That's not how you build trust. But I will say this. If humiliation finds you because of your own conduct, I will not protect you from it. If a camera finds you, if a lawsuit finds you, if your own conscience finds you in the middle of the night, you will face it alone." She stepped forward again, closing the distance between herself and the front row. Her eyes were alight with a fire that was both cold and immensely powerful. "I am giving everyone in this room a choice. Right now," she declared. "You can tighten up, step forward, and help restore the name of this uniform in this community." You can become the officers this city deserves. Or you can keep coasting in the shadows. You can keep protecting each other's misconduct. Keep telling yourselves that the blue wall will save you, and you can wait. Wait for the next body cam, the next civilian video, the next lawsuit that will strip another layer of trust from this department. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room one last time, a commander taking the measure of her troops. Her voice was quiet, but it held the unshakable finality of a judge delivering a sentence. Those who protect misconduct will not be protected by me. She picked up the small, polished nameplate from the front of the table, turning it over in her hands as if weighing it. This badge is heavy, she said softly, placing it back down with a quiet, definitive click. It should be. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving not a soul in that room to move until the door had fully clicked shut behind her. The commander's office was sparse, impersonal. It still smelled faintly of her predecessor, a stale mix of cheap cigars and even cheaper air freshener. Charlotte ignored it, her focus singular. She sat down at the large mahogany desk, the leather of the high-back chair cool against her uniform. Her first act as commander of this precinct was not to review personnel files or patrol schedules. It was to plug a small, black USB drive into the port of her computer. A moment later, a video file opened on the screen. It played without sound, a silent, damning pantomime of the morning's events. She saw Marcus's face, contorted in a mask of aggressive certainty. She saw Sophia's cold, mocking smirk. She saw Ethan's flicker of hesitation, and she saw it extinguished. She paused the footage at the moment Marcus's finger jabbed toward her face, his jaw clenched, his eyes hard with the conviction of a man who had never been told no. For a few seconds, she just stared at the frozen frame. Not as a commander, not as a woman in charge, but as a black woman who had stood still while 3 officers tried to erase her dignity without even asking for her name. With a series of precise clicks, she saved the clip to the drive, labeling the file with a simple, factual title, South Lot 7:42 a.m. A soft, hesitant knock came at her door. "Come in," she said, her voice even as she minimized the video file. The door opened slowly, and Ethan Mason stood in the doorway. He looked like a schoolboy called to the principal's office, his hands tucked behind his back, his eyes fixed on the floor. He stepped inside, his boots seeming to make too much noise on the polished floor. His voice, when it emerged, was rough with shame. "Commander Reed," he began, then stopped, swallowed hard, and started again. "I was hoping I could speak with you, just for a moment." She motioned to the chair across from her desk. He sat stiffly on the edge of it, still refusing to meet her eyes. "I should have stopped them," he said in a rush, the words tumbling out. "I knew it was wrong the second it started, but I froze. I told myself not to make it worse, but that didn't help, did it?" Charlotte leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. Her expression was calm, almost too calm. It offered no comfort, no easy absolution. "You came here to apologize," she stated, not as a question, but as an observation. "I appreciate that, but let me ask you a question. Officer Mason, if you had walked into that briefing and I was just another lieutenant, would you still be in my office right now?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and unavoidable. Ethan's gaze flickered up for a second, a spark of confusion in his eyes, before it dropped again. The silence stretched. He was replaying the morning not through the lens of his guilt, but through the lens of her question. A lieutenant, someone with rank, yes, but someone who could still be undermined, ignored, pushed aside by officers like Marcus. Would his conscience have been enough to compel him to act? The truth of it, bitter and unflattering, rose in his throat. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I don't know." "Commander," he finally whispered, the admission costing him more than the apology had. "I do," Charlotte said, her voice quiet but absolute. "And now you do, too. That's the place you start from." She let him sit with that uncomfortable truth for a moment longer before she continued, her tone shifting from inquisitor to commander. "You didn't yell. You didn't curse. You didn't lay a hand on me," she said, ticking off the obvious points. "But you also didn't stop them. You stood by, and that, Officer Mason, is where you failed. Not me. You failed the badge you wear." He finally looked up, his face a miserable portrait of shame. "Your duty in that moment was not just to avoid doing wrong. It was to prevent wrong from being done. By anyone. That is the job." She leaned forward slightly. "What kind of officer you choose to become tomorrow, and the day after that, will be your answer to that failure." Another knock, this one firmer, more confident. Before Charlotte could respond, the door opened and Officer Isabella Lopez entered, holding a thin file. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, took in the scene, the commander behind her desk, a picture of authority, and the young, guilt-ridden officer rising from his chair. Ethan mumbled a quiet, "Excuse me, ma'am," and practically fled the room. Isabella watched him go, a knowing look on her face, and before turning to Charlotte, she placed the file on the desk. "The preliminary report on the South Lot incident," she said, her voice professional but with an undercurrent of alliance. She glanced at the computer monitor, catching a glimpse of the minimized video player icon. "You want to file a misconduct report, Commander?" Her eyes then drifted back to Charlotte, and she paused. "Marcus has been here a long time. People are loyal to what they know. Be careful of the shadows in this place. They have a way of sticking to new paint." Charlotte offered a small, appreciative nod for the warning. She didn't answer Isabella's question directly. Instead, she maximized the video file, removed the USB drive, and held it between her thumb and forefinger. She walked over to a small, heavy safe tucked in the corner behind her desk, spun the dial with a series of practice clicks, and pulled the thick metal door open. "I'm not interested in reports just yet," Charlotte said as she placed the small black drive inside. "People show you their true colors when they think the fire has passed." She pushed the door shut, and the sound of the bolt locking into place echoed in the quiet office. "I'm giving them a choice. Isabella, what they do with it, that's on them." She walked back to her desk, her expression unreadable. "They think embarrassing me was the point, that they could put me in my place." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "They don't understand. I didn't walk in here like I own the place. I walked in here because I do." While a quiet strategy took root in the commander's office, in the bowels of the precinct, the seeds of defiance were already beginning to sprout in the sour soil of resentment. The locker room air was thick with the smell of old sweat, disinfectant, and simmering rage. Marcus Dalton slammed his locker shut so hard the clang echoed off the tiled walls like a gunshot. His face was a blotchy, dangerous red, and he paced the narrow space between the metal lockers like a caged animal. His usual swagger had been replaced by a raw, wounded fury. "I don't care what they say," he hissed to a small audience of officers who were pointedly not making eye contact with him. "You promote a woman like that, a quota hire, just because it looks good on some piece of paper downtown, and suddenly I've got to salute her like she's earned something?" She didn't climb the ladder. She was airlifted to the top. As Marcus ranted, a veteran sergeant named Kowalski, a man just a few years from retirement with a face like a worn leather glove, was methodically packing his duffel bag at the far end of the row. He heard every poisonous word. He didn't engage, didn't even look up. But for a moment, his hands stilled. He stopped folding his uniform, his gaze distant. Then, with an almost imperceptible slowness, he shook his head, a gesture of profound, weary disgust. He zipped his bag with a sharp, final rasp, slung it over his shoulder, and walked out without a word. His silence was not born of fear or agreement, but of a deep, bone-weary exhaustion with the very poison Marcus was spewing. Just outside the break room, Ethan had stopped dead in his tracks, a folder of patrol routes forgotten in his hand. He could hear Marcus's voice, sharp and ugly, carrying down the hall. The commander's words from her office, "What kind of officer you choose to become tomorrow," echoed in his ears. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. This was the choice. Right here. Right now. His hand trembled slightly as it slipped into his pocket, his fingers closing around the small, cool plastic of the voice recorder he used for taking notes on patrol. With a surge of adrenaline that felt like stepping off a cliff, he discreetly pressed the small, red button. The device was silent, its tiny microphone now capturing every syllable of Marcus's tirade. Ethan leaned against the wall, pretending to read the folder, his body a statue of feigned nonchalance, while a quiet, digital rebellion took place in his pocket. Miles away, in the suffocating quiet of her parked car, Sophia Marks was living a different kind of hell. The professional mask she wore with such ease had shattered, leaving behind a raw, panicked fear. Her phone was a weapon turned against her. She stared at the screen, at a looped 7-second clip of her own face, smirking with cold amusement as a black woman was humiliated. It was everywhere. News sites, social media feeds, her own friends' pages. The comment section was an unending torrent of vitriol. This is what racism looks like. Bet she's not laughing now. Fire her. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, each one a fresh wave of nausea. Her cousin had called, screaming at her. Her mother had messaged, pleading with her not to say anything stupid online. Her hands shaking, she scrolled through her contacts and pressed the icon for her father, a retired captain from another precinct. He answered on the second ring. "Dad," she said, her voice cracking. "They're tearing me apart online. They're calling me, 'You poked the bear.' Sophia," his voice came back, devoid of sympathy, cold and pragmatic. "I told you, you keep your head down and your mouth shut. Don't respond to anything. Let the department handle it. It's just noise. It'll go away." "But it's not just noise. They're using my face." "Then you should have worn a different face that morning," he cut her off. "Just wait it out." He hung up. Sophia stared at the dead screen, the silence in the car suddenly deafening. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white, a single hot tear of self-pity and rage tracing a path down her cheek. Back at the precinct, the institutional response was already in motion. A senior aide took a call in a glass-walled office, his expression carefully neutral. "Yes, Councilman," he said into the receiver. "We understand the optics. The commander is implementing a plan to contain the situation." A pause. "No, we don't believe protests are likely at this stage. We are working on a statement that will reassure the community of our commitment to—" He listened for another moment. "Yes, sir. We understand. It will be handled." The call ended. The priority was clear. Manage the narrative. Contain the fallout. Correct the problem? That was a different matter entirely. That evening, the city lights did little to brighten the gloom in Ethan Mason's small apartment. He sat at his kitchen table, a laptop open in front of him. The audio file he had recorded was playing softly, Marcus's voice a venomous whisper in the quiet room. He listened to every slur, every ounce of entitled rage, and he knew this wasn't just one man's mistake. It was a culture. The words of Commander Reed and the words from his father's journal echoed in his mind. Two halves of the same painful truth. He had been silent in it for too long. With a deep, steadying breath, he clicked into his email client. His fingers, now surprisingly steady, moved across the keyboard. He addressed the email to the Public Integrity Division of the State Inspector General's office. The subject line was simple: formal complaint regarding officer conduct. In the body he wrote everything: what he had witnessed in the parking lot, what he had recorded in the break room, and most importantly, why he had stayed silent. He didn't justify it. He didn't excuse himself. He simply said, "I knew it was wrong. I didn't stop it." He attached the audio file, a small digital bundle of undeniable truth. At the very end, he typed, "Respectfully, Officer Ethan Mason, badge 714. He hovered the cursor over the send button for a single, heart-stopping moment, the precipice between his old life and his new one. Then he clicked. The whisper had just become a warning, and just like that, the quiet click of a mouse in a small apartment became a crack in a wall of silence that had stood for generations. A wall built of fear, complicity, and the heavy weight of history. That same history was a quiet occupant in the commander's office later that night. The city lights twinkled through the large window, but they did little to dispel the somber atmosphere inside. Charlotte sat at her desk, the room lit only by the soft glow of a single lamp. Across from her, holding a cup of tea she'd barely touched, was Isabella Lopez. The day's adrenaline had long since faded, leaving behind a contemplative quiet. It was Isabella who finally broke the silence, her voice softer than usual. "I was there that day, you know," she said, looking into her cup. "At the academy, when they did that to Daniel." She looked up, her eyes filled with a regret that 2 decades had not managed to erase. "I was just a junior admin officer back then, scared of my own shadow. But I saw it all. I never told you, but I should have said something. I should have spoken up for him." The memory was sharp, sudden, and unforgettable. A scar Charlotte carried every day. It was her 4th month in the academy, a place that was supposed to forge character, but often just calcified prejudice. 3 white senior cadets had cornered her in the women's locker room after a grueling training session. It wasn't physical, it was worse. It was a slow, meticulous dissection of her identity, designed to make her feel like an alien intruder. They mocked the precise way she spoke, the texture of her hair, the way she stood too straight, like she didn't know her place. She had stood there, silent and shaking with a fury she couldn't show. When the door swung open, her older brother, Daniel, already a rising patrol sergeant at the time, had walked in to drop off a file. He saw everything in an instant, the smirking faces of the cadets, the predatory circle they had formed, and the look in his sister's eyes. He hadn't said a word. He didn't shout or draw a weapon. He simply stepped in between her and them, a wall made of fire and fury. His presence alone was an indictment, and they knew it. The cadets scattered like roaches in the light. The next morning, the institution made an example of him. They pulled him into the main yard in front of all the recruits, in front of her, a captain, a man with cold eyes and political ambitions who would later run for mayor, stood before him. With a look of theatrical disappointment, he stripped the sergeant's badge from Daniel's uniform. He held it up for all to see, then let it drop to the concrete ground. The metallic clang was the loudest sound Charlotte had ever heard. "You don't protect weakness in this department," the captain had announced to the assembled recruits. "Not if you want to wear this." In the present, Isabella shook her head slowly, lost in the same memory. "I remember Daniel," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He used to say the badge wasn't a shield. It was a lens. It didn't protect you. It just made everyone see you clearer. So you'd better be damn sure you liked what they saw. The old guard hated him for that. It's hard to hide when someone's holding up a mirror." "You were scared," Charlotte said, her voice not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact. "We all were." She didn't answer Isabella's regret directly. Instead, her hand drifted to the top drawer of her desk, pulling it open. She took out a small, square velvet box. She opened it and set it on the desk between them. Inside, nestled in the faded lining, was Daniel's badge. It was worn, scratched from years on the street, but it was still whole. "He wasn't protecting weakness," Charlotte whispered, her fingers gently tracing the worn metal. "He was protecting something this place never made space for: dignity." Hours later, in a quiet corner of the city, Ethan Mason sat on the worn wooden steps of his late father's porch, He hadn't been back to the house in months, but after sending the email, it was the only place he could think to go. He held a heavy, leather-bound journal on his lap. The cover still smelled faintly of tobacco and motor oil. The scent of his father, the scent of long shifts and blurred moral lines. His father had been a patrol cop too, back in the early 90s. A good one by all accounts. Until he wasn't, he had filed a detailed report on his own partner, a well-liked veteran who had roughed up a black teenager during a stop, breaking the kid's wrist for no reason other than contempt. They called it disloyalty. His father called it justice. They called it insubordination. He called it doing what he swore an oath to do. They took his badge, just like they took Daniel's. Ethan flipped through the brittle pages, some blurred with age, others still holding their anger like fresh wounds. His eyes landed on a yellowed sheet, his father's familiar, angry scrawl stopping him cold. He read the words that had been written a lifetime ago, in this very house by a man grappling with the same choice Ethan had just made. They talk about the blue wall like it's a fortress to protect us. It's not. It's a cage. And the price of admission is your own voice. Today, I heard a good man get called a rat for telling the truth, and no one, not even me, said a word. The silence was louder than the insult. Ethan closed the journal, the weight of his father's words settling into his own soul. He looked up at the darkened street and thought about Commander Reed. He thought about how she had stood in that parking lot, absorbing their insults, their threats, their venom, not because she was weak, but because she was strong enough to make her silence speak louder than their rage. And in that moment, it all became clear. She wasn't here simply to punish Marcus or Sophia. Her mission was bigger. She was here to repair the very thing that had shattered her brother, the same broken, silent thing that had destroyed men like his father. This newfound understanding didn't just solidify Ethan's resolve. It sent a shockwave through the system he had just challenged, setting in motion a series of events that would culminate 2 days later in a small, cold conference room. The air in the room was sterile and still, a stark contrast to the buzzing tension of the briefing held there just days before. The only occupants were 3 women seated at the long, polished table: Commander Charlotte Reed, Officer Isabella Lopez, and a woman whose calm, surgical demeanor radiated an authority all its own. Laura Brenner, from the State Inspector General's office, reviewed a set of papers through her glasses, her expression neutral. She looked up as the clock on the wall ticked over to the hour. "He's going to make this about loyalty," she said, her voice dispassionate, analytical. "About the brotherhood. He's going to paint you as an outsider who doesn't understand how things work on the street." Charlotte's hands were folded neatly on the table in front of her. She met the investigator's gaze. "Good," she replied, her voice low and steady. "Let him. The brotherhood is what's on trial. I'm just the evidence." The door opened and Marcus Dalton walked in. He tried to project his usual swagger, but it was strained, a brittle performance that didn't quite reach his eyes. He stopped for a fraction of a second when he saw the 3 of them waiting for him. His new commander, a colleague he had considered a reliable part of the precinct's furniture, and a stone-faced investigator from outside. He wasn't in control here, and the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He sat down heavily in the chair they had left for him, the silence in the room pressing in on him. Laura Brenner slid a small, digital audio recorder to the center of the table. She didn't offer a lengthy preamble. She simply pressed a button. "This is a setup," Marcus blurted out, his voice already defensive. Laura didn't even look at him. She just held up a hand, a silent command for him to wait. Then, his own voice filled the room. It was unmistakable, crackling with the poor acoustics of the locker room, but it was his, bitter, vicious. "Promote a woman like that. A quota hire. I've got to salute her like she's earned something. She was airlifted to the top." The recording continued, each word a self-inflicted wound. A flush started at Marcus's thick neck, creeping up his face, a tide of red shame and fury. He opened his mouth to protest again, but Laura spoke over the recording, her voice still calm. The audio is corroborated by a time-stamped clip from the locker room's own surveillance system. Officer Dalton, standard procedure. She pressed the button again, and the hateful echo of his voice died, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. It was Charlotte who spoke into that silence, her voice quiet but sharp enough to slice through marble. "You weren't out of line, Marcus," she said, using his first name for the first time, a subtle stripping away of his professional identity. "You were out of mask," he scoffed, a raw, desperate sound. "This is just political garbage. You walk in here playing the hero, but you don't know the first thing about how we do things." Laura Brenner, ignoring his outburst, calmly took out a manila folder, flipped it open, and began to read aloud, her tone as flat and unemotional as if she were reading a weather report. August 2018, complaint of excessive force during a domestic disturbance call. Subject sustained a fractured orbital bone. Complaint dismissed for insufficient evidence. March 2020. Official reprimand for insubordination, refusing a direct order from a superior officer. November 2022. Internal warning for racially biased comments made in the presence of a junior officer. The complaint was filed and then ignored. She continued, listing dates, incidents, and transgressions, a litany of abuses that had been buried by the very system he claimed to uphold. Each new entry was another brick removed from the wall he had built around himself, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. Stripped of his denials and his record laid bare, he fell back on his last, most sacred defense, the tribe. His eyes, wild with desperation, swung past Laura, past Charlotte, and landed on Isabella. His voice was no longer aggressive. It was pleading, a desperate appeal to a shared history he thought was immutable. "Izzy, come on," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You've known me for 15 years. We've been on calls together. You know who I am." He was begging her to validate him, to be a character witness, to rebuild the wall. Isabella held his gaze. There was no anger in her eyes, only a profound, quiet disappointment. Her voice, and when she finally answered, was even and devastatingly clear. "Yes, Marcus," she said. "I do. That's the problem." The words hit him harder than any physical blow. The blue wall he had hidden behind for his entire career had just crumbled to dust, betrayed by one of its own. His face contorted, disbelief warring with a terrible, final understanding. Laura Brenner slid a form across the table toward him. "Your badge and your sidearm, Officer Dalton," she said, her voice firm but calm. For a moment, he didn't move, his mind refusing to process the command. "Rick," Angela said, her voice now sharp, an order. With a strangled cry of pure rage and resignation, his hands shot forward. He didn't unclip his badge. He ripped it from his chest, the sound of tearing fabric sharp in the silent room. He slammed it down on the polished table, the metal ringing out like a death knell, with a final, snarling glare filled with a hatred too deep for words. He shoved his chair back, turned, and stormed out of the room. The door slammed shut behind him, the echo lingering in the air like gunpowder. No one spoke for a long moment, the aftershock of his violent exit still vibrating in the room. Finally, Laura looked at Charlotte, a flicker of grim professionalism in her eyes. "That was the easy part," she said. "Now comes the cleanup." Isabella nodded. "We'll handle it." But Laura wasn't finished. She looked down at her file, almost as an afterthought. "There's one more thing you should know," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. Officer Mason submitted a signed, notarized statement with a full audio log of other remarks, all dated and time-stamped. She looked up, meeting Charlotte's steady gaze. "He's asked to testify publicly, if needed." The revelation of Ethan's testimony hung in the air, a testament that the fall of one man was not an end, but the beginning of a far more difficult and necessary task: rebuilding from the ashes. The following morning, a tense and uncertain quiet had settled over the precinct. The usual boisterous energy was gone, replaced by hushed conversations and averted eyes. The news of Marcus Dalton's dismissal had spread like wildfire, and the air was thick with the unasked question, what happens now? Outside Commander Reed's office. Sophia Marks stood for a full minute before knocking. Her uniform was as sharp as ever, but the woman inside it seemed diminished. The hard, cynical edge in her eyes had been replaced by a deep, weary exhaustion. She held a single sheet of paper in her hand, folded once, a handwritten letter. When Charlotte opened the door, she didn't say a word, her face calm and unreadable. "I came to give you this," Sophia said quietly, her voice devoid of its usual sarcastic bite. She handed Charlotte the note. "I should have come sooner." Charlotte took the letter but didn't unfold it. She looked at the younger officer, her gaze steady and analytical, not offering condemnation, but not offering comfort either. The path to redemption, her silence seemed to say, was not going to be an easy one. "This letter tells me what you think, Officer Marks," Charlotte said, her voice even. "Your next 1,000 hours on the job will tell me what you believe." She held Sophia's gaze for a long moment. "Don't show me words. Show me work." Sophia met her eyes, a flicker of understanding, of a challenge accepted in her tired expression. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, then turned and walked away. There was no forgiveness spoken, but there was a shift, subtle and necessary, like a window being cracked open in a room that had been sealed for years. Later that week, the entire precinct gathered for what was officially labeled a formal recognition ceremony. It wasn't mandatory, but no one missed it. The air in the conference room was still tense, but it was a different kind of tension now, not of fear, but of curiosity and a fragile, burgeoning readiness for change. Charlotte stood at the front beside Isabella, both in uniform, both composed. She called Ethan Mason forward. He looked nervous, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. But as he walked to the front, he stood taller than he had just days ago. There was no hesitation in his step. "For moral courage in a moment that demanded silence," Charlotte said, her voice clear and strong. "Officer Mason has shown this department what integrity looks like when it costs something." The room was utterly still as she pinned a small bronze emblem, the department's award for ethical conduct, on his chest. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous or obligatory. It was steady, honest, and almost reverent. Even some of the older officers who had once looked at him with suspicion now watched with a newfound respect. Because truth, when finally spoken aloud, has a way of changing how people see each other. As the applause died down, Isabella stepped forward. "Starting next week," she announced, her voice firm, "this precinct begins a full reevaluation. From use of force protocols to community partnerships, nothing is off the table. Commander Reed and I will be leading the retraining personally. No more assumptions, no more silence." As the officers began to disperse, talking in low but energized tones, a quiet figure stayed behind. Sergeant Owen Banks, a veteran officer who had kept to the background for most of his career, a man with a quiet demeanor and sad, knowing eyes, cleared his throat and approached Charlotte. "Commander," he began, his voice a low rumble, "I was in the locker room that day. I heard what Marcus said." He met her eyes directly. "I didn't say anything. Didn't stop it." He paused, the confession hanging in the air. "But a few years ago, my partner and we were on a scene with Marcus. He got rough with a kid. Too rough. When we got back, I thought about filing a report. My partner told me to let it go, to just call it Marcus being Marcus, so I did. I've been letting Marcus be Marcus for 10 years. I'm done with that." He took a breath, a man making a stand after a decade of looking the other way. "If you're really building something new," he said, "I want to help carry the bricks." Charlotte had accepted his offer with a firm handshake, a silent contract that signaled the true work was only just beginning, not with demolition, but with the slow, arduous task of laying a new foundation, one brick at a time. Weeks passed, the headlines faded, the precinct adjusted. In a TV studio colder than it looked, bright lights beamed from overhead while quiet cameras slid across the polished floor. Charlotte sat on the edge of a guest chair, not nervous, just still. The talk show was called Voices of Reform, and for once, it lived up to its name. The host leaned in with practiced sympathy. "Commander Reed," she said, "there's been so much talk about the incident outside the precinct, the video, the fallout, but mostly about your silence. In that moment, facing all that hostility, why didn't you say more?" Charlotte looked straight ahead, her gaze going past the lights, past the cameras, into the quiet darkness of the studio audience. Her voice, when she answered, didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I said all I needed to say," she answered softly. "The moment I walked in," there was a pause, a moment of collective recognition in the studio. The host blinked, her next rehearsed question forgotten. A few days later, a small, handwritten letter found its way to her desk, tucked between official memos. It was from a 12-year-old girl named Janelle. "I saw you on TV. I liked how you didn't yell. My mom says quiet people don't win, but you were the quietest person and you still won. One day, I'll be like you." Charlotte read the letter in her office, the afternoon sun pooling across her desk. She held the simple lined paper for a long time, then reached into her drawer and pulled out a pen. Her response was brief, but it took her over an hour to write. "Janelle, don't be like me. Be better, but never forget the power of standing still. Sometimes change doesn't shout. It just shows up, and it stays." Late that night, long after the rest of the precinct had gone home, she was still in her office, looking out at the endless river of city lights. The door opened quietly. It was Isabella, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She placed one on Charlotte's desk without a word, a comfortable ritual they had developed. She followed Charlotte's gaze out the window. "Daniel would have been so proud." "Charlotte," Isabella said softly. Charlotte looked at her friend, a rare, unguarded flicker of emotion in her usually stoic eyes. She gave a slight, acknowledging nod, a silent thank you that conveyed more than words ever could. The new training programs were underway, and the culture of the precinct was undergoing a slow, tectonic shift. One afternoon, Ethan, now carrying himself with a quiet confidence that seemed years older than he was, saw a young rookie officer talking to a teenager by the side of the road. The rookie's tone was sharp, aggressive, full of the same unearned authority that had once dripped from Marcus Dalton. Ethan walked over calmly. "Let's take a breath. Officer," he said, his voice even. "What's the situation?" He expertly de-escalated the encounter, speaking to the teenager with a respect that instantly diffused the tension. Afterwards, he pulled the rookie aside. "Hey," he said quietly, "remember what the commander said. The badge is heavy. Let's make sure we're strong enough to carry it right." The rookie, humbled, looked at Ethan and nodded. A crucial lesson passed from one generation to the next. The cycle had been broken. Near the front steps of the precinct, a new bronze plaque had been installed on the old brick wall. It gleamed softly in the sun, its message simple and stark. "Command begins with character." Charlotte paused there one afternoon, her eyes lifting to the new inscription. She didn't smile. She didn't pose. She just looked at it like someone remembering an old friend. Behind that plaque, once upon a time, her brother had stood in the same spot, humiliated, punished, erased, but not forgotten. A breeze brushed past her collar, and for a fleeting moment, it almost felt like his hand on her shoulder. Then she walked on, calm, composed, carrying no banners, claiming no victory, but leaving behind a silence that would echo longer than most people's shouting ever could.